My fellow citizens of the United States, my brothers and sisters across Africa, and the countless millions around the globe who still believe in truth, justice, and dignity. I speak to you today not with pride, but with profound humility. I speak not as a man seated in robes of authority, but as a human being stripped bare by the weight of conscience. This is not an easy speech to deliver. In fact, it may be the hardest I have ever given, because for decades I stood on the side of the law, believing that in every judgment I rendered I was upholding fairness, believing that in every ruling I was defending democracy, believing that my robe was a shield against arrogance and abuse of power. Yet I was gravely mistaken. Yet tonight I must confront an undeniable reality that has haunted my soul. I failed. I failed Africa by failing Burkina Faso. And most directly, I failed you, President Ibrahim Traoré. When the case concerning $600 million was brought forth, the world saw it as another technical matter of international law, a dispute wrapped in the sterile language of contracts and obligations. But I knew even then that this case was not ordinary. It was never about paper, signatures, or digits written on financial ledgers. It was about dignity. It was about sovereignty. It was about the lingering belief in some corners of the world that African nations are still subject to external dictates, still bound by invisible chains of control forged in centuries past. And yet, despite knowing this truth deep within my conscience, I failed to resist. I allowed myself to be carried by a tide of tradition, a tide of precedent, a tide of arrogance that whispered into my ears that the order of the world must be preserved, even when that order was fundamentally unjust. I failed to ask the deeper question that should have guided my judgment. Who gave us the right to put a price tag on a nation's sovereignty? Who gave me the authority to treat an African leader chosen by his people as though he were a defendant in some theater staged for the world's amusement? President Traoré, I name you directly because I owe you directly, without reservation or qualification. When I uttered words that implied your nation, your leadership, your people could be weighed in the balance of an American court, I did not just insult you as a leader. I insulted your citizens, your ancestors, and the generations of Africans who bled and struggled to break free from colonial chains. It was not simply a legal failure. It was a moral catastrophe of the highest order. And so tonight I offer an apology, not the kind written by attorneys, polished with legal phrases, and hidden behind conditions and technicality. No, I offer an apology as a man, as a father, as a fellow human being who finally understands the depth of harm that words and judgments can cause when wielded without wisdom. To you, President Traoré, I apologize without reservation. To the people of Burkina Faso, I apologize. I apologize to the African continent. I apologize with every fiber of my being. This apology is not meant to erase the past, for no words can undo the sting of humiliation, the anger of injustice, or the deafening silence that followed when your dignity was trampled in the name of law. But it is meant to acknowledge the unvarnished truth. I was wrong. I was blinded by privilege, and I am deeply ashamed. For months I have lived with the relentless echo of my conscience. I have seen the images of African youths marching with your portrait, President Traoré, not because they worship a man, but because they see in you the courage to resist what their ancestors could not. I have read the words of African scholars who call this century the century of African reclamation, when Africa will no longer kneel before powers that once dictated its fate with impunity. And I realized with crushing clarity that in my courtroom, in my ruling, I stood as an obstacle in the way of that righteous reclamation. It is a strange and bitter irony that cuts to my core. The law that I once believed was the purest defender of human dignity became the very tool I used to diminish it. For while the $600 million lawsuit became a sensational headline across global media, the real cost was moral, the real damage was to trust between nations, the real scar was left on the face of justice itself. This is why I could not remain silent in my comfortable retirement. This is why I speak tonight with urgency, not to save face, not to protect a crumbling legacy, but to tell the truth while there is still breath in me to tell it. President Traoré deserves better than the treatment he received. Burkina Faso deserves better. Africa as a whole deserves infinitely better. And above all, justice itself deserves better than the mockery we made of it. I know that apologies from figures like me often ring hollow in the ears of those who have suffered. I know that across Africa, people may hear these words and say, "We have heard it all before." Apologies come like seasonal rains, but the systems of oppression remain unchanged. But let it be known across every continent, this is not an apology designed to ease my troubled conscience. It is an apology meant to spark a reckoning. Because if a man in my position who once upheld the very arrogance of the system can look the world in the eye and admit he was catastrophically wrong, then perhaps others will find the courage to follow. Perhaps, just perhaps, this confession will inspire the transformation that justice demands. Tonight, I am not defending a judgment I rendered in ignorance. I am delivering one upon myself with full knowledge of my failures. And the verdict is unequivocally clear. Guilty of arrogance, guilty of willful blindness, guilty of failing to respect the sovereignty of Africa. And so with all the sincerity I can summon from my wounded soul, I lay down that guilt before you, President Traoré, before your people, and before the conscience of the watching world. When I first put my signature to words that challenged the sovereignty of Burkina Faso, I convinced myself with practiced self-deception that it was duty, that it was law, that it was the natural order. Yet law without justice is nothing more than organized tyranny, and order without fairness is merely sophisticated oppression. I see that now with crystal clarity, but I was blind to it then. And for that inexcusable blindness, millions have paid in disappointment, in righteous anger. I confess to you all tonight with no attempt at self-justification. I was not deaf to Africa's cries by accident. I was deaf by deliberate choice. It was easier to cling to comfortable precedent than to open my heart to uncomfortable principle. It was easier to guard the crumbling walls of tradition than to admit that those walls had long been built on foundations of inequality and systematic exploitation. It was easier to believe that a $600 million claim against an African nation was somehow legitimate than to admit that it was nothing more than a weapon, a tool sharpened specifically to wound the pride of a nation that dared to refuse to bend its knee. President Traoré, I gravely underestimated your character and resolve. I thought you would bow as so many others have been forced to bow. I thought you would negotiate a humiliating silence as others have done before you. And in your magnificent resistance, you exposed not just my personal error, but the fundamental arrogance of an entire system designed to perpetuate inequality. I remember with shame the day your defiance became headline news across every continent. The world was watching with bated breath, waiting eagerly for your collapse, predicting your inevitable downfall with almost gleeful anticipation. They said you were too young, too inexperienced, too isolated to withstand the crushing pressure. And yet, you withstood it all with dignity intact. You held firm not just for Burkina Faso, but for every African nation that has ever been told by foreign powers that its destiny must be signed in foreign ink, approved by foreign courts, legitimized by foreign institutions. And while you stood tall like an unshakable mountain, I, with all my years of experience, my institutional power, my privileged position, crumbled beneath the weight of my own conscience like a house of cards in a storm. This is precisely why I call this apology not merely personal but profoundly historical in its implications. For it is not only I who must admit devastating fault, but the very system I once defended with misguided loyalty, a system that has too often clothed its naked greed in the respectable garments of legal procedure, that has too often wielded its authority not as a humble servant of justice, but as a ruthless instrument of domination and control over the powerless. And so tonight, I have stripped away those false garments in my public confession. There is a haunting question that has tormented me these past months, robbing me of peaceful sleep and comfortable certainty. Why Africa? Why has Africa so often been chosen as the theater where global power plays out its cruelest and most heartless performances? Why has the continent that gave birth to humanity itself been forced to bear such systematically inhuman burdens? Why is it that when an African leader speaks courageously of sovereignty, the world hears dangerous defiance, but when a Western leader voices the exact same principles, the world hears noble patriotism? I do not pose this question to distant scholars, though they may write countless volumes in scholarly answer. I ask it directly to myself because I must face the uncomfortable truth that I played an active role in sustaining that hypocritical double standard. The uncomfortable truth is I played my shameful role in sustaining that double standard, and to deny it now would be to deepen the wound I helped inflict. So let me be completely plain and unequivocally clear. I was fundamentally wrong to stand in arrogant judgment over you, President Traoré. I was wrong to imagine that a courtroom in Washington or New York, in Brussels or Geneva, has any legitimate right to put Africa itself on trial. I was wrong to treat the sacred sovereignty of a people as a mere legal clause that could be debated like a contract dispute, diminished like a commercial disagreement, or dismissed like an inconvenient technicality. I know my words may sound painfully late, and perhaps they are indeed too late, but maintaining silence would be even later, and silence in the face of injustice would be infinitely worse. For if I do not speak the truth now, then the future may remember me not as a judge who finally found his lost conscience. Let me also say this with absolute clarity and unwavering conviction. This apology is not directed only to President Traoré, though he bears the brunt of my failures. It is equally to the mothers in Ouagadougou who felt the sharp sting of international disrespect when their proud nation was named in a foreign courtroom as though it were merely a corporation facing bankruptcy. It is to the hard-working fathers in Bobo-Dioulasso who till the ancient soil with their own hands, who ask for nothing from the world but basic human respect, and yet were told that their honest labor, their justified pride, their cultural heritage, could somehow be accurately weighed and measured in American dollars. It is to the children across the vast African continent who watched this shameful drama unfold on their television screens and were told once again by the actions of institutions like mine, this is exactly how the supposedly civilized world sees you, as perpetual defendants in courts you never chose, never as true equals deserving of respect. I want them to hear me tonight with perfect clarity. I want them to hear me admit without equivocation that this is not justice by any reasonable definition. This is not equality, and it absolutely must not define the future we build together. I am not naive about the limitations of words, no matter how sincere. I know that my heartfelt apology will not single-handedly dismantle centuries of accumulated injustice. I know that my words tonight will not magically erase the exploitative treaties that systematically stole African land, the predatory debts that deliberately enslaved entire African economies, the biased judgments that routinely demeaned African leaders, or the devastating wars that were cynically sanctioned in the hollow name of peace and democracy. But I hope with every fiber of my being, I pray with desperate earnestness that my words may serve as one small but significant crack in the towering wall of institutional arrogance that has stood for far too long between Africa and the fundamental respect it deserves from the international community. Some will inevitably ask me with skepticism, Judge Robert, why choose to speak now? Why deliberately expose yourself to harsh criticism, to public ridicule, to the concentrated wrath of those who strongly prefer comfortable silence on these matters? And I answer with complete sincerity, because silence is no longer a morally acceptable option for anyone with a functioning conscience. Because I have seen the unstoppable future emerging before our eyes, and it belongs to Africa without question or qualification, and because I would rather face the temporary judgment of my professional peers than the permanent judgment of history, which is far less forgiving of cowardice and complicity. Tonight, I am not here to desperately preserve a tattered reputation built on compromised foundations. I am here to restore fundamental truth to a conversation poisoned by decades of institutional dishonesty. I am here to restore truth to a world grown comfortable with lies. And the truth is this, spoken without legal jargon or diplomatic evasion, President Ibrahim Traoré, the lawsuit directed against you and your sovereign nation was a profound injustice wrapped in legal terminology. The $600 million claim was not legitimate law as we pretended. It was a calculated insult designed to humiliate, and my personal role in legitimizing this travesty was nothing less than a betrayal of the sacred oath I took to serve justice without fear or favor, without regard to race or nationality. When I look back honestly at the long and troubling history of international judgments, legal rulings, and diplomatic decisions made in the supposedly noble name of international law, I cannot help but feel the crushing weight of institutional hypocrisy pressing down on my conscience. For centuries, powerful nations have systematically cloaked their naked ambitions in the respectable language of justice and international order. They declared devastating wars in the hollow name of peace. They imposed crippling financial debts in the false name of economic development. They carved arbitrary borders through ancient communities in the presumptuous name of political order. And they wrote biased judgments in the empty name of legal fairness, judgments that were anything but fair to those without power to resist. I was raised from childhood to believe unquestioningly in the essential purity of the law. I was taught in law school that the scales of justice are blind to wealth and power. But I now see with painful clarity that blindness can also be deliberately selective, strategically blind to the suffering of the systematically oppressed, willfully blind to the inherent dignity of those who have been historically silenced by force and intimidation. President Traoré, your courageous defiance was not merely a legal defense of Burkina Faso's immediate interests. It was a mirror held up to the entire world, reflecting our deepest hypocrisies and most shameful contradictions. In your unwavering courage, you showed us what many in positions of power refuse to see, that Africa is no longer content to be a silent participant in its own systematic humiliation, that the long era of externally dictated terms and unquestioned foreign rulings is finally ending forever, that a continent once dismissed by colonial powers as a passive subject of history is now confidently asserting itself as the active author of its own destiny. And I must say this directly to my fellow Americans, to Europeans, to every citizen of the Western world who hears my words tonight with whatever degree of comfort or discomfort they may bring. We must understand with absolute clarity what has fundamentally changed in the global balance of power. Africa is not patiently waiting for our gracious permission to breathe freely. Africa is not humbly begging at our tables for scraps of recognition. Africa is not bending submissively under our traditional weight of expectation and control. Africa is rising with unstoppable momentum, and our choice as Western nations is starkly simple. We can choose to respect that inevitable rise with grace and wisdom, or we can choose to be left behind by the relentless march of history. The lawsuit worth $600 million was clearly intended to remind Africa of what we imagined was its proper place in the global hierarchy. But instead of achieving that goal, it served to remind the entire world of Africa's unbreakable strength and unshakable resolve. The precise moment Burkina Faso chose to stand firm against international pressure, the tide of history shifted dramatically across multiple continents. Young men and women across Africa, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, saw in President Traoré a powerful reflection of their own suppressed voices, their own legitimate longings for dignity, their own capacity for justified defiance against injustice. They marched through the streets not with destructive bitterness, but with constructive hope, not with consuming hatred, but with inspiring dignity that shone like a beacon of possibility for oppressed people everywhere. And I, watching these events unfold from the very institution that had attempted to undermine that hard-won dignity, was forced by circumstances to confront an uncomfortable truth about myself and my complicity. I was standing firmly on the wrong side of history, aligned with the oppressors instead of the oppressed, defending the indefensible instead of challenging it. To the people of Africa, I say this tonight with all the sincerity my damaged credibility can summon. You do not need my personal validation to be worthy of respect. You do not need my institutional approval to claim your rightful place in the world, but you absolutely deserve both my respect and my public apology. Too often throughout history, apologies from men in my position are quietly offered in private rooms, buried in confidential diplomatic letters, whispered in words that never reach the ears of those who were most directly wronged by our actions and inactions. Tonight I deliberately speak not in diplomatic whispers, but in public broadcast, because the original wrong was shamefully public, and therefore the acknowledgement of that wrong must be equally public and unambiguous. The humiliation was broadcast globally for all to witness. The acknowledgement of error must be equally global in its reach and impact. Some in America will inevitably ask me with genuine confusion, Judge Robert, are you somehow betraying your own nation? Are you abandoning the sacred oath you swore to American institutions? And I answer with moral clarity, absolutely not. For the highest oath any human being can swear is not to a particular flag or a specific courtroom or even a beloved nation. The highest oath any person can make is to universal truth, to impartial justice, to our common humanity that transcends all artificial boundaries. And when I witness clear injustice, whether it occurs in my own comfortable backyard or across distant oceans, I cannot and will not remain loyally silent in the face of obvious wrong. True patriotism, properly understood, is not the reflexive defense of national wrongs simply because they are committed by our own institutions. True patriotism is the moral courage to admit those wrongs publicly and work actively to correct them, regardless of personal cost or professional consequences. To the youth of Africa, I want to address you directly with words of encouragement born from hard-won wisdom. Do not allow my personal failure and moral blindness to discourage your own efforts for justice. Do not let the historical arrogance of Western courts convince you for even a moment that your collective voice is somehow small or insignificant in the grand scheme of global affairs. You are the largest generation in the entire history of the African continent. You are the vibrant heartbeat of a continent whose time has finally and irrevocably come, and your persistent insistence on fundamental human dignity will not be denied by anyone, anywhere, at any time, regardless of their institutional power or traditional authority. President Traoré, I am acutely aware that your leadership role has not been easy to bear. The pressures placed upon you are truly immense. Political pressures, military pressures, economic pressures that would break many leaders. I know that nations far richer and far more militarily powerful than Burkina Faso have actively tried to break your resolve, have systematically tried to paint you in international media as dangerously reckless, as fundamentally illegitimate, as completely unworthy of the respect accorded to other world leaders. And I know with certainty that in many influential parts of the Western world, your name is spoken with deep suspicion and barely concealed fear of what your example might inspire in other African leaders. But tonight, let the entire world hear me say with absolute clarity what should have been acknowledged long ago by institutions like mine. Your unwavering insistence on national sovereignty is not recklessly dangerous, it is morally righteous. Your determined resistance to external control is not blind defiance of international order. It is the dignified assertion of legitimate rights. Your political struggle is not dangerous isolation from the international community. It is profound inspiration for millions of people worldwide who yearn for the same respect and dignity you demand for your people. I cannot undo the calculated insult of placing Burkina Faso in the dock of foreign judgment like a common criminal defendant. But I can say this with complete moral clarity and unwavering conviction. It will not happen again, not with my voice raised in support, not with my consent freely given, not while I have any remaining influence to prevent such injustices. The judicial robe I once wore as a symbol of ultimate authority, I now hold instead as a heavy reminder of the enormous responsibility that comes with power over others' lives and dignity. And I solemnly vow that in whatever years remain to me on this earth, I will spend them not defending institutional arrogance and systematic injustice, but actively dismantling both, piece by piece, brick by brick, until justice truly becomes universal rather than selective. To my fellow jurists around the world, I say with the urgency that comes from painful experience, the world is changing rapidly and fundamentally, and we must change with it or risk becoming completely irrelevant to the cause of justice. If law is not firmly rooted in universal justice, then it is no law at all worthy of respect. And if justice does not fully recognize the inherent dignity of all peoples, then it is no justice at all, but merely organized oppression. This public apology tonight is not the end of my moral journey. It must be only the beginning of genuine transformation, both personal and institutional. I cannot promise what other governments will choose to do in response to this confession. I cannot promise what other courts will decide when faced with similar moral choices, but I can promise with complete certainty what I personally will do with unwavering determination. I will no longer remain silent when I witness injustice. I will no longer hide behind the comfortable language of legal precedent when moral principles are at stake. I will no longer deliberately confuse mere legality with true morality or mistake long-standing tradition for eternal truth. And to you, President Traoré, though I once had the arrogance to see you as nothing more than a defendant in my courtroom, I now see you with clear eyes as a profound teacher whose example has transformed my understanding. For in your magnificent resistance to unjust pressure, you taught me what I had forgotten during my years of comfortable institutional power. That true power is never found in the ability to condemn others, but always in the moral courage to stand firmly for what is right, regardless of consequences. And now, as I approach the close of this long overdue apology, I must speak not only to President Traoré, not only to the proud people of Burkina Faso, not only to the African continent, but to the entire world that has witnessed this shameful moment in international relations. For this moral crisis is not merely about one biased lawsuit, not merely about $600 million in disputed claims, not merely about one compromised judge and one courageous president standing in opposition. This is fundamentally about the larger story of how we as humanity choose to live together with dignity in the 21st century and beyond. Will we continue to build towering walls of institutional arrogance between nations based on wealth and military power? Will we continue the shameful practice of treating some voices as inherently powerful and others as permanently disposable? Will we continue to disguise systematic domination as impartial justice and dare to call this organized oppression a just international order? Or will we finally have the collective courage to admit the fundamental truth that every nation, regardless of its current size, regardless of its accumulated wealth, regardless of its complex history, deserves equal respect, deserves inherent dignity, deserves genuine equality in all international forums where the fate of peoples is decided. I stand here tonight before the judgment of history and declare openly and without reservation, I choose the path of equality. I choose universal dignity. I choose mutual respect between all nations. And I confess with no excuses or justifications that I once chose wrongly, blinded by privilege and institutional loyalty. But today, before the watching eyes of the world, I turn completely from that shameful wrong. I turn from that wrong with every fiber of my being, knowing full well that true redemption requires sustained action over time, not merely eloquent words spoken in a moment of belated conscience. President Traoré, I do not expect you to forget easily the sharp sting of international insult directed at you and your nation. I do not expect the proud people of Burkina Faso to erase from memory the humiliation of being placed under the judgment of foreign courts. But I hope with humble sincerity you will hear the genuine remorse of a man who has looked honestly into the mirror of his own soul and seen his grievous faults with perfect clarity. I hope you will hear the transformed heart of someone who, though once deliberately blind to injustice, has now been given the precious gift of moral sight by witnessing the inspiring courage of your people in their struggle for dignity. Their collective strength opened my closed eyes when years of comfortable privilege had sealed them shut. I also hope that my own nation, the United States of America, hears me clearly tonight, with whatever discomfort my words may bring to those invested in maintaining the status quo. For this moral reckoning is not only about Africa learning to rise with justified confidence, it is equally about America learning to listen with genuine humility to voices we have too long ignored or dismissed. Too often we have spoken with authority when we should have listened with respect. Too often we have presumed to judge other nations when we should have sought to learn from their experiences and wisdom. Too often we have automatically assumed a position of global leadership when we should have practiced true partnership. If we are genuinely a nation that believes in freedom and justice for all people, then we must learn to recognize and celebrate freedom wherever it rises in the world, not only when it serves our immediate national interests or conforms to our cultural expectations. And let me speak with absolute clarity to my colleagues in law, in government, in international diplomacy who may be listening tonight. Africa does not need our gracious permission to be sovereign and self-determining. Sovereignty is not a privilege graciously granted by foreign courts or international institutions. It is inherent in the nature of peoples. Sovereignty is not a gift bestowed by treaties written in distant capitals. It is the natural birthright of all nations. Any international system that denies this fundamental truth is ultimately doomed to collapse under the crushing weight of its own moral contradictions and historical hypocrisy. I also speak tonight with deep respect to the elders of Africa who personally endured the brutal era of colonization and then lived to see political independence come like a long-awaited dawn that somehow never fully broke into the bright day of true freedom. To you I say, with the reverence due to those who have suffered much and persevered, the dawn of genuine African independence has come again, but this time it will not fade into disappointment. This time it will shine with the full brightness of a continent that is unashamed of its identity and unafraid of its destiny. I speak to the young men and women, the students and farmers, the builders and dreamers who chant the names of leaders who dare to stand up against injustice. Do not lose heart in the face of temporary setbacks. Your voices are growing stronger each day. Your future is absolutely real, and the world is listening to your demands for justice, whether comfortable powers want to or not. I know with certainty there will be those who dismiss this public apology as nothing more than elaborate political theater. They will say it is too little, too late to matter. They will call my confession weakness rather than strength. They will accuse me of betraying the institutions I once served. And perhaps they are right about one thing. This apology is indeed painfully late in coming. But it is definitely not too late to finally tell the unvarnished truth. It is not too late to admit serious fault where fault clearly exists. It is not too late to start again with honesty and justice as our foundation rather than power and privilege. True weakness is not found in admitting when we have been wrong. True weakness is found in clinging stubbornly to error, like a drowning man clings to stones that drag him deeper underwater. And betrayal is not found in confessing our errors publicly. Real betrayal is found in refusing to face those errors when the clear mirror of truth reflects our failures back to us with undeniable clarity. So I speak to you now, Africa, with no judicial robe to hide behind, no ceremonial gavel to pound for emphasis, no impressive courtroom to lend authority to my words. I speak only with the hard-won honesty of a man who finally understands, after years of willful blindness, what should have been obvious from the beginning. You do not need to be defended by institutions like mine that have so often failed you. You need only to be respected as equals. You do not need to be lectured by those who created many of the problems you are now courageously solving. You need only to be heard with the attention your voices deserve. You do not need apologies like mine to define your worth or validate your place in the world. You are already clearly defined by your remarkable resilience, your unbreakable strength, your inspiring unity, and your absolutely unshakable will to be free and self-determining. But still, if you will allow me this moment of humble confession, permit me to bend the institutional pride of my own nation, of my own legal system, and say the simple words that the world has too rarely spoken to you with genuine sincerity. We are sorry for our arrogance. I am personally sorry for my role in perpetuating injustice. I was wrong, and I take full responsibility for that wrong. History will ultimately judge me for this confession. Perhaps that judgment will be harsh, perhaps it will be merciful, but far more importantly, history will judge this entire era based on the choices made by people like me. History will ask whether men and women in positions of institutional authority continued the destructive arrogance of the past, or whether we found the moral courage to change course when fundamental change was desperately needed. I pray with all my heart that when the definitive books are finally written about this pivotal moment, this public apology will not be seen as an isolated moment of individual conscience, but rather as the first step in a much greater turning point in international relations. A turning where Africa is no longer placed on trial by foreign courts, but placed at the table as an equal partner in shaping global decisions. A turning where leaders like President Traoré are not treated as dangerous exceptions to international order, but as respected equals deserving of the same dignity accorded to any world leader. A turning where fundamental human dignity becomes non-negotiable rather than subject to debate, and where respect for Africa's sovereignty becomes undeniable rather than grudgingly given. And so I conclude tonight, President Ibrahim Traoré, with these words, simple in their phrasing yet profound in their sincerity. I apologize to you personally and without reservation. I apologize to your people who deserve so much better than the treatment they received. I apologize to Africa as a whole for my role in perpetuating systematic injustice. And I pledge solemnly that for whatever days remain to me in this life, I will carry this transforming truth in my heart and actions, that justice without genuine respect for all people is no justice at all worthy of the name. And that respect for Africa is not a diplomatic choice we can make or decline based on convenience, but a moral necessity for any system that claims to serve humanity rather than merely the powerful. May this apology be far more than empty words spoken into the night. May it be the genuine beginning of a new chapter in international relations, not for my own legacy, but for the world we leave to our children and their children after them.